talk about misidentification at Iwo Jima, this is something, kiddos, that happened in July of 2015, 70 years later. And you don't have to write this part down, but it started when Clint Eastwood was directing a film called Flags of Our Fathers. And he hired someone to make sure that the uniforms in that famous flag raising were authentic. He wanted everything authentic, to detail. Well, when this guy started checking into this, it started a controversy of proper identification, and recent evidence that he came up with showed that Navy Corpsman John H. Bradley was not in the photograph at all, which is really odd because he was the most centered in the photograph and probably should have been the best person identified. And the reason they came to the conclusion that he was not in the photo is because what he, quote, was wearing didn't match Navy specifications. Okay? That's how they picked this thing up. Well, if you look at my little drawing I gave you, it'll help you get this under control. The recent evidence showed that Navy Corpsman John H. Bradley was not in the famous photograph at all, and the man identified as John H. Bradley in the photograph was actually Frank Sousley, who was originally identified in a different position. That's why on the map little thing I gave you, I got John Bradley, arrow down, not in photograph, and the guy that they originally identified as Franklin Sousley is where John Bradley is. So the question is, who takes Frank Sousley's place? Who is that guy? Because Bradley is out of the picture. Well, new evidence identified Marine First Class Harold Henry Schultz as the 6th flag raiser at Mount Suribachi. Anybody have him they wrote a paragraph about? What did you find out about him?
What you just said, and he was like, he didn't ever say anything except to like his close family.
Right.
That he was in the picture.
Yeah, well, that's just eerie. That's exactly what I wanted you to get out of that. We'll explain that to you. Well, I'm going to let the movie explain the details of the identification more than I will, because it's good. But basically what I'm saying is they looked at that person that was originally Frank Sousley, and they noticed that his helmet was unstrapped in the photograph. So they went looking for people in this particular photograph, which is known as the Gung Ho photograph, and they were looking to find someone in that photograph, because this is a photo after the 2nd flag raising of a military person that had their strap undone on their helmet. And if you look at this picture here, on what would be his left side of his face, you see kind of a weird thing. That is actually the unstrapped strap. Then they went further and they looked at the photograph of what used to be Frank Sousley and looked at the position of his sling. Was it sling attached at the top of the rifle barrel or down below? And they tried to match up someone in the Gung Ho photo that had the rifle sling in that unusual position, and both cases pointed to this man. Both cases pointed to that man, Harold Henry Schultz. Now, that was because of the Gung Ho photograph that you have in front of you. Tell you a little bit about him. He was just 19 years old at the time, from Michigan, and he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps 1 month shy, kiddos, of his 18th birthday. He was only 17 years old when he enlisted in World War. Enlisted, didn't get drafted, enlisted. That'd be like you kids enlisting right now and end up at Iwo Jima. Schultz was later wounded at Iwo Jima, and he received the Purple Heart for bravery in battle. Aaron told me that your uncle, or what was the story?
Great uncle.
Your great uncle received the Purple Heart at Iwo Jima as well.
Yeah.
So he survived, which means you were wounded in battle. That's a big deal. Big honor. So Schultz is wounded at Iwo Jima, survives, and receives the Purple Heart for bravery. Did you figure out what he did after he got out of the service, dear? Did you get that far?
Me?
Yeah. Did you report? Did you figure that out? Did you read anything about that? Okay, well what he did After his military service, he moved to California and he worked for the Postal Service until he retired. Okay, there you go. Well, come on, don't short. Well, if you know anything, let me know. After his military service, he moved to California and worked for the Postal Service until his retirement. Well, in the early 1970s, he began a friendship with his neighbor lady and her daughter. They became very good friends. And 18 years later, because of their friendship, he married the lady. So he now has a stepdaughter. Okay? Kind of a cool story. So in the early 1970s, Harold Schultz begins a friendship with his neighbor lady and her daughter. And finally, 18 years later, the two marry. And one night, he opens up to his stepdaughter about the events at Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima. And he admits to her that he was one of the 6 original flag raisers in the famous Rosenthal photograph. And she asked him why he didn't say anything. And what did he say? He said, I was a Marine. I did my job. Wasn't looking for that type of glory. He kept that a secret for 70 years, so to speak. Well, not quite 70. Because I'll tell you the story. It wasn't quite 70. So he admits to his stepdaughter that he was one of the original flag raisers in the famous Rosenthal photograph back in 1945. He dies in 1995. This is just odd. This is incredible. He dies in 1995. His stepdaughter goes through his belongings from World War II, and she finds this famous gung-ho photograph in his belongings. Okay? And on the back, he has documented every single person in the photograph and mentions documents at that time that he was one of the 6 original flag raisers at Iwo Jima, and kept that a secret for years and years. He put the names on shortly after he was discharged, and he even wrote on it that he was one of the 6 flag raisers. How about that? The United States Marine Corps, who would be a tough nut to crack, admitted in July of 2015 that the research was correct, and they have officially accepted the research that John H. Bradley was not in the photograph. Frank Sousley was where Bradley was, and Harold Schultz was where Sousley was.
What I read was that John Bradley knew he wasn't in the photograph, but he was just told not to say anything.
There you go. That's my next thing. So the question comes up, why would John Bradley go 70 years probably knowing he wasn't in that photograph, right? I mean, you'd know that, wouldn't you? Now, he might have been in the first flag raising. That was a possibility, and I'll let the video explain that more. But he probably knew he wasn't in the second flag raising. But what did they do, Lily? Why? Because they brought him back and made him part of a savings war bond campaign in which they raised $26 billion, and that probably wouldn't be the best PR to say, oh, by the way, this guy actually wasn't in the photograph. Because the photograph kind of saved American morale, if you heard, because people were appalled by the number of deaths. But this just image that Joseph Rosenthal took kind of was a spiritual uplifting for Americans, thinking we're about got this thing done, right? And what are the chances of him getting that photograph? What do you think about it? I mean, Pulitzer Prize winning photographs are sometimes taken just at the spur of the moment. Here's another example. Here's a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald while he's handcuffed to Jim Lavelle. That was a split-second thing, and Bob Jackson just happened to catch the exact moment the bullet entered, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. There's another photograph up there, Kim Phuc, we'll talk about this in Vietnam, during the Agent Orange dropping in a village in Vietnam. Her clothes are on fire. She throws all of her clothes off and runs down the street naked because her clothes are on fire, burning a big percentage of her body anyway. That's a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. They're just actions in history that it's by chance. Okay? So, any questions at all on that? Okay, what we're going to do, kiddos, is we're going to draw for this second winner, and then we will start the period. It'll be about a period long, the unknown flag racer of Iwo Jima, and you'll get the whole story from start to finish how this unfolded. Last thing I want to tell you is this. This was uncovered in July of 2015. I took kids back to D.C. in the spring of 2016, and they had taken all of the information off of the information boards around the statue in DC. We went the next year in 2017, still blank. Went the next year, this last year, 2018, still blank. I'm really hoping that our bunch gets there and they've made this thing corrected. Who knows? I don't know why they have not. But they took them down and never put them back on. Huh?
Maybe you don't know how to explain how they missed it then.
Well, this movie here, I was surprised it didn't get more publicity than it did.